So, what if eating the way that our ancestors have in the past is actually a more optimal choice than trying to come up with some new age fad way of taking care of our health with respect to diet? And what if there's actually 3 or 4 different ways of approaching eating like our ancestors that may actually give each individual a better idea of what's appropriate for them? Say if there was 4 diets and you could try each one out for a couple of months, and one of them just turned out to make you feel the best ever, that's your diet. So I'm going to basically walk you through what each of those diets is like, but I'm going to put it in the context of why this is so important for people. So let's take that leapfrog back in time and look at what human beings were doing around food. Now, it's important, I think, to just bring up 2 really qualifying points. When we're talking about an ancestral diet, we're talking about you tracking back what your ancestors were doing, what they were eating, how they were living, because you might get some really good insight on how to be more specific for yourself. And number 2, if you go back far enough, say 6,000 years for most of the developed world, everyone was homesteading. So what's a homesteading diet look like? I'll come back to that. So if you go before people were homesteading, then they were probably more like hunter-gathering. And then if you go back a little bit farther than that, they were probably more like scavenging and, breaking bones and, doing things like that. And then if you go back farther than that, and this is a tricky thing, you can look it up. It's called the Aquatic Ape Theory. It's pretty established proof as to a huge part of human evolutionary past that we don't really, talk about in school for whatever reason. But that way of living and eating is also therapeutically very powerful. So I'm going to go back through the whole thing from homesteader to hunter-gatherer to scavenging and to what we did during ice ages at the beach, just in more detail. So if you were to imagine it's 5,000 or 6,000 years ago and you're homesteading, you've probably got goats and chickens and pigs and cows or something that's kind of analog to that, which means you're going to be having pretty consistent access to animal proteins, animal fats, animal byproducts, preserved meats, smoked meats, things like that. And also you're going to have access to things like dairy. Of course, this is old school homesteading, pretty much pasture raised organic, best ever. But that would be, at least a seasonal part of your dietary resources. Most of what you'd be eating during the winter would come out of a root cellar. And if you did happen to have the access to make things like, say, fields of grain to not only feed yourself through winter, but to feed all of your animal, friends and partners in life, then as you're eating those kind of grains and maybe porridges and stews and eventually breads and stuff like that in winter, again, primarily, you'd also be eating a lot of fat with it. And this is super important, you'd also be eating some kind of preserved vegetables. If it would be sauerkraut or kimchi or kefir or all of the things we have now. I mean, there's obviously yogurt if you've got cows and goats. So this is a really, really robust, it's nutrient dense, it's calorically dense, in the sense that if you were to eat like 3 big meals a day of homesteader food, it would be kind of like eating at a buffet in the sense of just how much is, potentially on your plate. And I bring that up because, as we try and focus on our health around diet, and a lot of us maybe eat too often or too much, what's I think a really important thing to recognize about people who were actually living on a homesteader diet is they probably had 14 hours a day of chores, probably including picking up cows and putting them back into corrals and things. So if you're imagining yourself wanting to choose that diet, you're either going to have to keep your portions pretty small or hint, hint, and get really invested in a lot of movement, a lot of exercise, because you can't really try and you can't really live on that kind of ratio of, carbohydrates to proteins to fat, even including fermented foods and stuff like that. It's going to be a lot easier and safer and healthier for you if you're living like a homesteader in the sense of your fitness, your physicality, movement, exercise. I think one other thing that people often ask me about is what about wine or, a little bit of alcohol once in a while. Again, if you're focusing on something as complicated as an autoimmune disease, or if you're focusing on a cleanse, I do a lot of cleanse courses with people. And maybe this is a good point for people who are watching this. If you're thinking about doing one of my cleanse programs, you have lots of choices as to what you eat. You could do the homesteader diet or the rest I'll describe in a minute. So again, with alcohol, you want to be really careful that your use of alcohol is consistent with your actual health. And keep in mind, most of us don't really think about things in their historical context, but this is an ancestral diet conversation. So The use of alcohol primarily in most of human history was either as a disinfectant or something you would add to water as like an ale or a weak beer, so that people would drink the water. Because especially in like I don't know, medieval villages and homesteading places and stuff like that, often the water would become basically septic. So keep in mind, if you are using alcohol, it's not the ideal thing, but it's not absolutely horrible once in a while, unless you have to be really careful about what's going on in your gut, because alcohol effectively is an antibiotic. So if you're trying to recover from the overuse of antibiotics and maybe you have SIBO or Candida or some other condition that's, really you don't want to be messing with, obviously with your liver and stuff, then you're going to want to get rid of alcohol for sure. So that's basically a homesteader diet. And if we were to look over at what we call the hunter-gatherer diet, or what a lot of people call a paleo diet, that's based on the perception of what people would have been eating for the, maybe 200, 300,000 years or more or less, that our ancestors were traveling around migratory, following, large herds of game, and also having a very seasonally driven diet, which is something I think the modern paleo diet isn't really quite as focused in on as perhaps they could be. So that diet is basically one of the most efficient diets in the world for improving human health if you actually really do it right. And there's a lot of ways that it's presented in the world that make it look a little bit right, but a little bit wrong. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. So before I get into sort of my argument with the paleo diet, I just want you to be aware that when you look at that diet, the term you want to have on the tip of your tongue is going to be nutrient density, because the more nutrient dense your diet is, in the sense of everything you eat that has calories is, a protein, it's a fat, it's a vegetable, it's a plant, it's something that has more than just calories in it. Whereas if you're eating grains and bread and obviously sugar and alcohol and things, you're getting a lot of calories, but you're not getting any real nutrients. So the thing about the paleo diet or the hunter-gatherer diet is it is an insanely nutrient-dense, super easy to make gourmet, healthy diet. Having said that, though, my problem with the paleo diet is that, honestly, if you go back 10,000 years, 100,000 years, where are you going to find the metal to make grill marks? Because when you look at a lot of paleo diet books, it's like gastro porn for a barbecue salesman. Everything is grilled. And I should speak for me from a sense of credibility here. I actually grew up in a hunting lodge, and I've been teaching things like hunting and trapping and tracking and fishing in a survival kind of primitive skill sense in various ways for, 30 something years. So I would just want to say that on a practical experiential level, I'm pretty sure that a person raised as a Paleolithic indigenous person, especially by their elders who knew what they were doing, would never actually cook meat over a fire on a stick the way that you do in like a cowboy movie. So not to try and go on some big conspiracy thing, it's just to bring your attention to the idea that we have some misunderstanding, I think, about what cooking methods would have been in Paleolithic times. So if you are going to go on a paleo diet, it's going to be lots of animal products in the sense of lots of fats, lots of protein, but it's also going to be profoundly plant-based. And I usually say this when I'm teaching workshops in the bush. The reason why most healthy diets are so high in plants is because plants can't run away. So we've obviously adapted to a diet that's the most efficient for us. So even if you want to be like a CrossFit athlete weightlifter, you're still going to get the most metabolic benefit from still having a plant-based looking meal, in the sense of, if this was a plate, lots of vegetables, maybe some root in the sense of a bit of a starch, some protein, and then a lot of fat all over the place, dips and sauces and gravies and all kinds of fun things. So the more enriching we can make it, obviously, the more nutrient dense it'll be. So when I think of sort of a practical list of things for a paleo diet, I'd be thinking like obviously stir fries and stews and soups and curries, casseroles, things where I can just mix a lot of vegetables and proteins and fats together into a pot and make it really easy, because not only does that solve how to have a meal, it solves basically what you're going to do for lunch tomorrow. So that's sort of a quick overview of what we call a paleo diet. So if we go back a little bit earlier than that, there's going to be this important kind of context to bring up, because most of human evolution, and well, I guess most of the evolution in life, is based on fundamentally how we adapt to the biggest challenges we face. And I would say that's true of each of us in our getting through a day, through a year, through your whole life. It's, you learn and grow based on the hardest things you've adapted to. So when you look back at human evolution, the hardest things we've adapted to fundamentally were ice ages. So I'm just going to ask you to kind of take your imagination and recognize that all life would have been pushed towards the equator, and then it would have stopped raining during every ice age, right? So every time that happens, there's going to be a bit of what I would call a bar fight, where all the mammals fight over the land in the sense of who's predator, who's prey. But again, there's no rain because it's an ice age. And people who live in trees, like primates, our early ancestors, had no home. So what they eventually ended up doing is dispersing and living at the ocean, again, with what we call the Aquatic Ape Theory. And fundamentally, we went through this group of stages, and I don't know, for some reason I'm making the gesture of like an accordion here, but the ice ages come and press everyone together, and then we spend some time at the beach. And I just imagine primates living at the beach, knocking mussels off of rocks, and eventually getting up the courage to walk around in the surf to grab, I don't know, lobsters and crabs and things like that. And then eventually to have the courage to start swimming. And then the ice age recedes, and whatever evolutionary pressure has happened during the ice age, we're maybe losing hair, we're changing the structure of our nose so it's a better air trap. But then, the weather gets better. So then we migrate away from the ocean following the fresh water, and we're going to start finding all of these animal kills, where maybe the animals didn't have the time to sit there and gnaw through all of the bones. So there's a period of time between what I would call the Ice Age diet and the big hunter-gatherer diet, where we were fundamentally scavenging the kills from wolves and other big primates, basically following ravens and crows around to find our food. And of course, we were still eating lots of plants because they don't run away. But our primary animal source of food would have been deeper connective tissue, brains, and lots of marrow, and meat if we could knock something down or trap it ourselves. So when we look at those sort of two earlier diets, they're both relatively ketogenic, relatively high in anti-inflammatory, very stabilizing, nourishing fats. One is focused more on a lot of fish, one's focused more on saturated fats. Both have a certain amount of plants, and at a certain threshold of plants over fats, you're no longer in a ketogenic state, but you're still basically running on probably the cleanest ratio of fuels you could choose, right? So, just think, I don't know, salad with a lot of sauce on top or something. If you want to get more deep into those diets, that's something I'll be doing specific videos and podcasts about, because nutritional ketosis and getting into a ketogenic diet in the modern world, where you may have to still commute and travel and things like that, is really, really a uniquely challenging thing to do. However, if we go back a little farther and we just decide to stay at that, deep Ice Age kind of diet, and honestly, I call the Ice Age diet because I like to make fun of the fads like the Paleo Diet, because I don't know. It's just my sense of humor. So when you go and you do look at what I would call an Ice Age diet, what I would encourage people to be the most aware of is not only you're focusing on nutrient density and a pretty high ratio of anti-inflammatory fats, at the same time, because we're trying to look at this as therapeutically in terms of potency, that diet should be as actively anti-inflammatory as is possible. Right. And that's sort of the tongue-in-cheek part of the Ice Age diet is, ice, inflammation, ice fire. Because for most people, if they went on a really deeply focused, serious Ice Age diet, then, or an anti-inflammatory diet, then your whole immune system can reestablish a better baseline, even in as short as 5 days. And that would literally be looking like eating things like sashimi, which is fish that's been frozen to a really low temperature so that the little flukes that are in fish, the parasites, can't make people sick. There's ceviche, which is, fish that's been cooked and cured in lime juice and made into a big salad. All those yummy anti-inflammatory vegetables, from cucumbers to celery to, everything else that has that capacity. Then there's, say, avocados and healthy fats. And so again, talking about the Ice Age diet, and again, being a bit tongue-in-cheek, one thing to think about is just what would be growing around the equator, because again, that would be more or less where we would have found ourselves. So I'm thinking, maybe coconut oil is still a good idea for that diet, because it would be a fairly equatorial, robust food source. Avocados again. So I also think about, if a bunch of primates or early humans were living at the beach, they would have a freshwater source coming into the, little beach camp or whatever they're up to. So another really important source of good foods would be all the vegetables that actually grow in or next to moving water. You know, you got all of your cilantro and watercress and parsleys and things like that are not only nutrient dense, they also have some really unique medical properties. So, real quick review. If you're doing the homesteader diet, you can have maybe oats, white rice, preferably cooked in fat once in a while, but you're going to have a lot of kimchi and sauerkraut. If you are going to do dairy, make sure it's organic, full fat, as local, grass-fed if you can, as well as any kind of meat and things like that. Try and focus on being as seasonal as you can, especially with high carbohydrate foods like a lot of roots and against if you're going to be doing rice and oats. Go before that, we're looking at what people call a paleo diet, or what I like to say tongue-in-cheek about the real paleo diet, where you don't barbecue anything. Everything is stewed and braised and cooked in a way that actually mimics the cooking style of people who would be primarily cooking things in pit bakes, or cooking the whole animal in its skin in a coal bed, or maybe drying the meat but at a distance so it's not going to get actually charred or burned. Or obviously like clay pots and stuff. So braised meats, lots of vegetables, lots of stews and soups and stir fries. And again, it's so convenient if you can make those kind of meals, because then they're really easy to take to go. And then we have that ketogenic kind of high saturated fat version of a ketogenic diet. Obviously, I don't think there's a lot of people who are going to be trying to live on bone marrow for more than a day, but you do want to try and figure out that. And again, that's going to be a separate video because doing the ketogenic diet is pretty tricky. And then again, finally, we're at that Ice Age diet where you're focusing in on anti-inflammatory plants, fish as close to raw as you're willing to tolerate. And any kind of high fat, anti-inflammatory, antibacterial kind of food, say like avocados, coconut oil, and things like that. So I hope that gives you a sense of just sort of human evolutionary history kind of in reverse with food. It'll give you this should give you at least some basic pointers or lists to get started. And again, if you are looking at doing some kind of cleanse program, working with someone like me or somebody else in functional medicine, integrative medicine, and you know that they're going to trump out all the food stuff, then at least you know what your negotiation possibilities are. Because I often will take patients, depending on their diagnosis and how sick they are, and will either, if people are doing fairly well, start at the homesteader diet, and if they don't get better, we'll go back to the paleo. If they don't get better, we'll meander back and forth around the Ice Age scavenger diets. Or if a person is particularly unwell, we'll start them the Ice Age diet with getting rid of as much inflammation as we can. And then we'll move up to what I would call that nutrient-dense kind of ketogenic diet towards the paleo diet. And if people stay healthy there, then they stay there. If they don't, then they go back to the Ice Age diet. And we keep doing that until they can stay healthy at the paleo diet. And then we move them on to the homesteader diet. And that can take up to 2 years. So it really just depends on your diagnosis, your age, and how aggressive your condition is. So my name is Dr. Michael Smith. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please like and share and subscribe. If you already subscribed, welcome to the team of healthy primates that came from beaches trying to do right in the 21st century.